to get to cleft palate surgery.
Ng mga batang may cleft palate.
Ang hindi pagsasara.
The condition colloquially and derogatorily referred to as ngongo or in Hiligaynon Sungi is technically called bilateral cleft lip and palate, one of the most common birth defects across the world. In this video, we will explore the embryologic principles behind bilateral cleft lip and palate. What is a cleft lip and a cleft palate? These are congenital deformities that occur during early embryologic development, more specifically from the 4th to 12th weeks of gestation. The failure of the facial processes to grow or fuse properly during this period can lead to cleft lip and cleft palate. When the tissue that makes up the lip does not join completely before birth, this results in an opening in the upper lip, also known as cleft lip. If the tissue that comprises the roof of the mouth does not join together completely, this leads to a cleft palate. What can happen for some babies is that both the palate's front and back parts remain open, while others only have part of the palate open. This defect is not as immediately visible as a cleft lip. It is also possible for a child to only have cleft lip without the cleft palate, or vice versa, or to have both defects at the same time. We begin at week 4 of conception. Here, the embryologic development of the face commences with a neural crest ectomesenchyme, which consequently leads to 5 prominences: the central frontonasal prominence, the paired maxillary prominences, and the paired mandibular prominences. Moving on the 5th and 6th week of embryonic development. Here, you can see the fusion of the bilateral maxillary processes illustrated in purple and the medial nasal process illustrated in green. This allows the formation of the upper lip, alveolus, and the primary palate. Interaction between the frontonasal prominence and maxillary prominences also play a role in palate formation. We can also see thickening of nasal placodes that comprise the medial and lateral nasal processes. The nasal placodes then move downwards, and this will then form the nasal pits. The upper lip, alveolus, and primary palate are formed through the fusion of maxillary processes with the medial nasal process. Then the 2 palatal shelves form the secondary palate. Within the oral cavity, you can also see the beginning of the primary palate's development. Now, 6 weeks after conception, the secondary palate begins forming. The 2 palatal shelves extending from the maxillary process's internal aspect. Then the median palatine process is next. It is formed with the merging of the 2 medial nasal prominences. At the same time, the secondary palate is formed from the lateral palatine processes from the maxillary prominence. We are now at week 8 to 12 of gestation, where the development of the secondary palate occurs. At week 8, the lateral palatine processes are vertical, but in a matter of hours, they rapidly change their orientation to horizontal. The tongue is now able to descend, and room is made for palate fusion, thanks to the protrusion of the developing mandible. The axial and sagittal planes fuse. The median palatine process and the 2 lateral palatine processes lead to creation of the palate. It is then joined by the nasal septum, which goes down from the frontonasal prominence. This also leads to the separation of the 2 nasal cavities. After fusion is completed, there is ossification of the primary palate's mesenchyme and the anterior secondary palate. This process results in the hard palate. On the other hand, the soft palate is formed when the posterior secondary palate develops muscle. So now that we are familiar with the normal development of the face and palate, let's see what could possibly go wrong during the process and lead to cleft lip and palate. Cleft lip may occur unilaterally or bilaterally. Unilateral cleft lip is the failure of the maxillary prominence to fuse with the corresponding medial nasal prominence on one side, while bilateral cleft lip is the failure of a pair of maxillary prominences to fuse with each of their corresponding medial nasal prominence on both sides of the face. While cleft palate may occur as anterior cleft palate, which is the failure of the primary palate to fuse with the secondary palate, while posterior cleft palate is the failure of secondary palate or the palatal shelves to fuse with the nasal septum. It may also present as both anterior and posterior cleft palate. Cleft lip and palate is a complex trait, and there are over 10 genes that can contribute to its development. In addition, exposure to environmental factors during crucial points in gestation also plays a role. They may suffer from issues and complications related to airway function and respiration, feeding, dental health, speech, language, and even hearing. On top of all these, living with cleft lip and palate brings with it a myriad of social challenges that can take a huge toll on a child's self-esteem. Raising awareness of the impacts of this condition and ensuring accessibility of management options are crucial to uplift the lives of millions of afflicted children worldwide. This video was brought to you by SGDA with the help of the following references.